Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Imagine the air of Florence. A still morning, where the mist seems to hum softly against the bells of the Duomo. The streets are narrow, the stones still damp from the night's quiet rain. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps, slow, deliberate, a craftsman walking toward his tiny workshop. Now listen carefully, because what you are about to hear is not just the story of a city, it is the story of time itself, the moment when humankind decided that the sun and stars were not enough. That time must be measured, owned, and shaped by human hands. No one in Florence, in the late 13th century, could have imagined that small gears and iron teeth would one day divide the hours more precisely than any monk's prayer or any shadow cast on a sundial. But inside a dimly lit shop near Piazza della Signoria, a quiet revolution was beginning, one tick at a time. The suspense was not loud, not violent. It was made of patience. The steady breath of a man bent over a table, his fingertips blackened by soot and metal filings. His name, though history remembers it faintly, was Lorenzo di Giacomo. He was a clockmaker before the word clockmaker even existed. Some say he began with bells. The Florentine churches were his first clients, each one demanding that their bell ring precisely on the hour for prayers, so no parish could claim the other had stolen time from them. So Lorenzo watched. He listened to the rhythm of hammers and ropes, and he began to ask a forbidden question. What if the bell could ring itself? That question, whispered under his breath one late winter night, was the first spark, and from that spark the world would never again be the same. Florence in the 1200s was not yet the Florence of grand palaces and Michelangelo's marble dreams. It was a city of merchants, stonemasons, and guilds, each trade guarding its secrets like a jealous lover. The Arte dei Orify, the goldsmith's guild, held sway over metalwork, and it was within their rules that young artisans like Lorenzo found their path. Gold, silver, brass. These were not merely materials. They were the vocabulary of precision. Every piece of metal sang a different note when struck, and the clockmakers listened. Each hammer fall was a heartbeat, each tooth of a gear a breath. They worked not for beauty alone, but for control, to make time obedient, mechanical, measurable. At first, the people of Florence resisted. What need have we for these ticking contraptions, they would say. The sun and the bells are enough. But the merchants knew better. For trade depended on timing, the opening of markets, the counting of hours, the fairness of contracts. When you owed a man by the hour, you needed something more precise than the shadows of a tower. And so the city began to turn its ear to a new sound. A faint ticking, a grinding of metal hidden behind church walls and workshop doors. One of the earliest clocks in Florence was mounted on the Palazzo Vecchio. It was not beautiful, at least not in the way art was beautiful. It was rough, made of iron and oak, but when its hammer struck the bell, the city heard something sacred. The sound was different from the hand-pulled bells of old. It was clean, rhythmic, mechanical. It was, for the first time, human time. And yet, it was imperfect. The gears slipped. The weights tangled. Sometimes the bell rang too soon, sometimes too late. But each mistake taught the craftsman something new. A fraction of a second reclaimed from chaos. The monasteries were among the first to adopt these new devices. In the silence of San Miniato al Monte, monks gathered to watch the strange iron beast mark their prayers. They stood in awe, some in fear. For centuries, they had marked time by the light of heaven, not by the hands of man. But now, the clock did what the sky had done, without needing permission. It was said that one monk whispered, "We have caged the sun." Lorenzo's fame spread slowly. His clocks were not perfect, but they were alive. Visitors came from Pisa, Siena, and Venice to watch the strange mechanisms breathe in their steady rhythm. Florence became known for its men who made the hours walk. By the year 1330, other artisans had joined the craft. Bartolomeo di Francesco, Tommaso d'Andrea, and later Giovanni da Dondi in Padua, whose astrarium would become one of the wonders of medieval Europe. But it all began here, in the cramped workshops along the Arno River, where men mixed the smell of iron with candle wax and prayer. Every tick was a defiance of nature, a small declaration that man could command time. Sometimes late at night, when all of Florence slept, the sound of these early clocks could be heard faintly across the city. Deep, patient, alive. Those who listened long enough said they could feel it beneath their ribs, like a second heartbeat. And perhaps they were right. Because time, once a mystery written in the stars, was now being written in metal and motion. And yet, not all was as peaceful as it seemed. One winter morning, as the mist rolled over the rooftops, the bell atop Santa Maria del Fiore struck 13 times. No one knew why. The clock had never done so before. Lorenzo was summoned in haste. He climbed the narrow stairs, his hands trembling. And when he reached the gears, he froze. Something was wrong. The weights were intact, the chains unbroken. But there, lodged between two gears, was a single piece of parchment. A note written in fine ink. Time belongs to no man. He never discovered who had written it. Some said it was a rival guild member, warning him not to claim mastery over God's domain. Others whispered it was a message from a monk who feared divine retribution. But a few believed, and Lorenzo was one of them, that the clock itself had spoken. After that day he worked more carefully, his movements slower, almost reverent. He began to talk to his clocks as if they were alive, whispering to them as he adjusted their gears, asking forgiveness for forcing them to divide eternity into pieces. And if you listen closely in the museums of Florence today, where fragments of those early machines rest behind glass, you can almost hear it still, a faint ticking like a breath caught between centuries. The sound of Florence learning to measure its own heartbeat. The city began to change, almost without noticing. The market stalls opened at the same hours each day. Merchants began to measure work by the hour rather than the daylight, and even the bakers started timing their bread to the rhythm of the clock's bells. Florence was unknowingly being shaped by sound, by the deep, even pulse that echoed from its towers. People called it progress, though they didn't yet understand what it meant. For the first time, time itself was being divided, organized, sold, and shared. The heartbeat of Florence was no longer the rhythm of the sun but of the gears turning above them. In those same years, the art of clockmaking was spreading like a quiet fever through Europe. But in Florence, it became something sacred, a blend of science and soul. Each craftsman treated his creation as a living thing. They would polish each wheel by hand, whispering under their breath, "Go gently, go steady." They were priests of a new faith. Precision. The tools were simple, hammers, files, pincers, and tiny drills, but the work was not. Each part had to fit perfectly, or the clock would fall out of rhythm. The slightest misalignment could send the whole mechanism into chaos. The men who could master such balance became legends within the guilds. Their names were spoken with respect, sometimes even fear. For in a way they had learned to control what no man ever should, the passing of time itself. But there was beauty in their obsession. If you stepped into one of their workshops, you would find a quiet world. The air was thick with the scent of oil and hot metal. The only sounds were the gentle rasp of files smoothing brass, the occasional strike of a hammer, and the faint ticking of some prototype hidden beneath a cloth. In those small rooms, the line between art and machinery blurred. Light would fall across the tables, catching the golden edges of gears and the pale blue of burnished steel. Everything seemed alive. By the mid-14th century, Florence was home to dozens of small clock workshops. Each craftsman guarded his secrets, but all were linked by an unspoken code: respect for time itself. They competed fiercely, sometimes bitterly, yet they understood that their rivalry was also collaboration. Every improvement one made lifted the others forward. It was during this period that another Florentine, Niccolò di Bernardo, began designing a clock that would change the city forever. He wanted to build something that could not just mark hours but display them visibly. Hands that would move around a face, showing the progress of the day. His inspiration came from the human heart, he said. The pulse beats without ceasing, and so should time. Niccolo's design would later inspire the famous clock of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo. That clock still exists, its dial painted by Paolo Uccello, the great Renaissance artist. But in those early years the concept was unheard of. To make a hand move in circles, precisely, endlessly, required more than gears. It required patience beyond human measure. He worked for months, often sleeping in his workshop, candles burning until morning. His neighbors said they could hear him talking to himself, murmuring numbers, sketching in chalk on the floor, erasing, beginning again. There was a strange tenderness in his work. He was not building a machine, he said, but giving Florence a heartbeat it could see. When the first prototype was finished, it was crude but mesmerizing. The face was hand-painted, the numbers uneven, but when the iron hand began to move, slowly, almost shyly, people gasped. It was like watching the stars turn on command. The crowd outside the workshop fell silent, then broke into applause. Niccolo stepped back, his eyes damp. For the first time, Florence could see time moving before their eyes. The church elders soon took notice. They saw in this invention both wonder and danger. To measure time was to control prayer, to decide when men should stop working, when they should rest. The clock could become a tool of power, or a threat to it. Meetings were held in secret chambers of the cathedral, where the priests debated the morality of mechanical time. Was it an act of pride to bind the divine flow of hours into gears? Or was it a gift of human intellect, bestowed by God himself? In the end they decided it was both, a miracle and a warning. And so, the Duomo clock was commissioned. Vast, heavy, magnificent. Its face would be placed high above the cathedral's entrance, so that every Florentine would look up and remember who held the hours. Niccolo oversaw the construction himself, guiding young apprentices, including a quiet boy named Matteo, who would one day become his greatest rival. The work was grueling. Iron had to be forged in the heat of summer, gears balanced to the fraction of a grain, ropes twisted by hand from hemp shipped across the Arno. The bell alone weighed more than a man could lift. Each piece was hoisted by pulleys that groaned and creaked under the strain. Yet the men worked in silence, reverent, as if aware that what they built was not merely a clock. It was the future. When the final mechanism was raised into place, and the bell struck noon for the first time, the sound rolled through the city like thunder. Windows shook, pigeons scattered, and people stopped where they stood. Some crossed themselves, some wept. For the first time, Florence could hear its own measure of eternity. But in that triumph came unease. Niccolo began noticing something strange. The clock would sometimes lose minutes, then gain them again without adjustment. No one could explain why. The mechanism was flawless. Every gear was clean. Yet time itself seemed to rebel, refusing to be perfectly contained. He tried to hide his concern, but the thought haunted him. One night, unable to sleep, he returned to the cathedral alone. The city was silent, the moonlight cold. Inside, the clock loomed above him, its hands faintly visible in the pale glow. Niccolo climbed the wooden stairs behind the face, candle trembling in his hand. He checked every joint, every pin, every spring, all perfect. Then he heard it, a sound that should not have been there. Not the steady tick of gears, but a soft, uneven whisper, like breath between heartbeats. He froze, listening. The candle flickered. For a long moment, it seemed the clock itself was breathing. He told no one. The next morning the clock was perfectly on time. But from that night forward, Niccolo began marking his own hours differently. He carried a small sandglass in his pocket, as if he no longer trusted what he had created. Time, it seemed, had a will of its own. The sandglass became Niccolo's secret. He would turn it over quietly when no one was watching the thin stream of sand slide through the narrow throat of glass, perfectly obedient, never faltering. He said it comforted him. The soundless, steady fall, a reminder that time could still move without iron, without noise. But deep inside he feared the silence. The clock he had built seemed to breathe, whisper, almost think. It was as if the city itself was alive within it, pulsing with unseen rhythm. Florence was no longer a city of sunrise and sunset. It had become a city of hours. Shopkeepers opened when the bell rang. Markets closed when it rang again. Artists began to time their labor by it, and apprentices were scolded if they came 5 ticks late. The people of Florence had learned to obey metal instead of the sky. The rhythm of the clock ruled all things: trade, prayer, even love. Lovers met by the 3rd chime after dusk. Bread was baked to the count of bells. Time had become an invisible master. But not everyone was at peace with this new power. There were whispers in the streets that man had gone too far, that time was meant to flow free, not to be chained to the teeth of gears. Old philosophers who once taught in candlelit halls muttered that humanity had stolen fire once again, not from the gods this time, but from eternity itself. And somewhere deep inside the cathedral, where the dust gathered thick on the beams and the wind moaned through the bell tower, the clock continued its steady pulse. Even when no one listened, it ticked. Patient, eternal, indifferent. Niccolo's apprentice, Matteo, had grown into a man now. His hands steady, his eyes sharp. He adored his master, yet he also envied him. Where Niccolo worked with faith, Matteo worked with hunger. He dreamed not of obedience to time, but of surpassing it, creating something even more precise, more perfect, more alive. He studied late into the night, tracing each line of the clock's design, every joint, every spring. And one night, while oiling the gears, he noticed a faint irregularity, a shadow of movement between the escapement and the weight chain. It was so small that any ordinary craftsman would have ignored it, but Matteo watched closely. The gear paused, only for the length of a heartbeat, and then continued. He smiled. The great clock of Florence, the masterpiece of his master, was not flawless after all. The next morning, when Niccolo arrived, Matteo spoke gently, respectfully, of his discovery. But Niccolo's face grew pale. "You saw nothing," he whispered. "You heard nothing." His hands trembled. He turned away, refusing to meet Matteo's eyes. The young apprentice left in confusion, but that moment carved a quiet wound between them. Weeks passed. Rumors began to circulate that Niccolo was growing ill. He came to the cathedral less often, his once sure steps slower, his gaze distant. He muttered to himself about breathing metal and the pulse of stone. Matteo, worried, began to take over the maintenance himself. But he, too, began to feel something uncanny when he stood alone before the great clock, a sense that the mechanism listened. When he adjusted a screw, the gears seemed to hesitate, as though aware of his touch. One stormy night, the thunder rolling across the Arno, the bell of the Duomo rang 12 times, and then once more. Again. Matteo ran to the tower. Rain lashed against the windows, lightning flashing through the gears. The clock trembled as if alive. He reached the mechanism, soaked, gasping, and froze. The pendulum was swinging by itself, though no wind touched it. The counterweights were still, yet the hands were moving faster than ever. The sound filled the room louder and louder, not ticking but beating. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, Matteo could hear the faintest whisper, so soft it might have been his imagination. "You cannot hold time." He fled. The next morning, the people of Florence found Niccolo dead in his home, a small sandglass clutched in his hand. The clock, when checked, was perfectly accurate. The city mourned its master craftsman. His funeral drew guildsmen, priests, merchants, and nobles alike. They praised his skill, his patience, his devotion. But Matteo stood apart, his heart restless, for he could not forget the whisper in the tower, nor the strange calm on his master's face. Weeks later, Matteo returned to the cathedral. The night was still, the city sleeping. He climbed the narrow stairs, candle flickering in his hand. The great clock loomed above him, motionless, vast, serene. He stood before it, breathing slowly, feeling the chill of the iron. He reached out and touched the pendulum. For a moment nothing happened. Then, faintly, gently, the mechanism stirred. The gears turned once, twice, and then began to move on their own. Matteo watched spellbound. The hands on the clock face began to move backward. Time itself was reversing. Not in the city, not in the world, but within the machine. He stared in awe as the candlelight flickered over the brass and steel, and he whispered, "Niccolo, what have you done?" Then it stopped. The silence was total. He stepped back, trembling. The pendulum hung perfectly still, like a breath held in the air. Matteo never spoke of that night. But from then on, he devoted his life to studying the rhythm of clocks, the way each one seemed to have its own temperament, its own heartbeat. He became known as the listener of time. And in his notes, preserved today in fragments at the Museo Galileo, he wrote one strange line: "The clocks of Florence do not measure hours. They measure souls." In the years that followed, Florence continued to thrive. Painters filled their studios with light. Sculptors carved eternity into marble, and merchants measured profit by the minute. But beneath it all, unseen, unheard, the rhythm of those early clocks pulsed through every wall, every heart. Florence had not just built machines. It had built a world that lived by the ticking of its own creation. And sometimes, when the night was quiet and the wind carried the sound of distant bells, people said you could still hear Niccolo's whisper riding on the echo. Slow, steady, endless. Time breathes. Listen. By the time Matteo grew old, Florence had changed beyond recognition. The city's skyline bristled with towers, each one crowned with a bell or clock face that gleamed in the morning sun. Time had become a rhythm shared by all, merchants, monks, artists, and children alike. The city no longer woke with the light of dawn but with the chime of iron. The streets would stir to the sound of bells echoing across the Arno, and the heartbeat of Florence could be heard in every courtyard, every workshop. Matteo often sat by his window, watching the shadows lengthen across the cobblestones, his thoughts lost in the slow movement of the sun. Yet in his heart, he listened not to the world outside but to the pulse he knew so well, that faint, secret rhythm that the clocks carried. He was no longer building new machines. His hands had grown unsteady. Instead, he spent his days writing, long scrolls of notes about the motion of gears, the patterns of sound, the intervals of silence between ticks. He was searching for something no one else dared to imagine, the soul of time itself. He began to notice something curious. Every clock he examined seemed to possess its own personality. Some ticked fast and nervous, others slow and patient. Some would lose seconds when it rained, as if the moisture in the air softened their resolve. He recorded each observation with meticulous care, whispering softly as he wrote. Each one breathes differently. To Matteo, the clocks were no longer tools. They were companions, witnesses of life passing through them. But his obsession drew skepticism. The other clockmakers, young and ambitious, laughed at his theories. They were men of iron and oil, not of mystery and breath. Clocks do not think, they told him. They only move. But Matteo would only smile faintly and say, "So do we." One winter, a wealthy patron from Venice arrived, intrigued by Matteo's reputation. He wished to commission a great clock for his palace, one that could show not only hours but the motion of the heavens, the dance of planets, the turning of the moon. Matteo hesitated, but the man's insistence, and his generous payment, persuaded him. This would be his last work, his final offering to time itself. He worked for months, his health fading but his spirit steady. The clock was vast and intricate, a masterpiece of brass, copper, and steel. Around its face were carved constellations, tiny stars set in silver, and at its heart, a pendulum shaped like a golden sun. Each motion of the mechanism was accompanied by the faintest hum, so delicate that one had to hold their breath to hear it. It was not just a clock, it was a symphony of motion. When it was completed, the Venetian nobleman arrived to witness the unveiling. As Matteo wound the mechanism and the gears began to move, the nobleman stood transfixed. The planets rotated in perfect harmony, the moon glided along its silver path, and the stars seemed to shimmer as if alive. Time had never looked so beautiful. But as Matteo watched the hands begin to turn, a strange sadness filled him. The rhythm was perfect. Too perfect. It lacked the tiny imperfection that gave life its soul. The clock ticked with mathematical precision, cold and unfeeling. It was flawless and utterly lifeless. That night, after the nobleman had left, Matteo remained alone with his creation. The workshop was silent except for the steady, mechanical beat. He leaned close to the clock and whispered, "You do not breathe." And then faintly he heard it. A soft sigh like wind through a keyhole. The gears trembled ever so slightly. The hands paused for a heartbeat, then continued, slower, gentler, as if they had heard him. Matteo smiled, tears filling his eyes. He closed his notebook and rested his hand upon the metal frame. "Now," he said softly, "you live." The next morning he was found at his desk, still seated, eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his face. The clock behind him was still ticking, steady and calm. The apprentices who came to collect his paper said that the workshop felt different that day. Warmer somehow, as though the air itself had taken a slower breath. His notes were later gathered and studied by scholars across Italy. Many dismissed them as the ramblings of an old man, pages filled with words like pulse, soul, breath, but a few saw deeper meaning in them. They began to notice what Matteo had noticed, that even the most precise instruments of time seemed to drift ever so slightly with the moods of the world, with the weather, the seasons, the quiet sigh of human hands. And so, slowly, the art of clockmaking began to change. No longer was it merely about precision. It became an art of empathy, an understanding that to make time move truly, one had to listen to it first. The next generation of clockmakers were poets of iron and brass. They spoke of rhythm the way musicians spoke of harmony. In Florence, a small group of apprentices who had once studied under Matteo formed a new guild, L'Art del Tempo Viventi, the art of living time. Their motto, carved above the door of their workshop, read simply, "Here before you build." Visitors would come to see them work in silence, their tools moving gently, as if they were tuning an instrument rather than forging metal. They said the clocks that emerged from this guild had a different quality. They did not tick harshly but seemed to breathe, to pulse in a soft rhythm that soothed the ear. People began to hang them in their homes not just for keeping hours but for comfort, a companion sound steady and kind in the background of life. And thus Florence, already the heart of art and invention, became the birthplace not only of mechanical time but of emotional time. Time that could be felt, not merely measured. Yet, behind this beauty, a quiet tension began to rise. Some feared that the clocks were gaining too much reverence, that people were beginning to trust them more than their own instincts. A priest at Santa Croce once wrote in his sermon, "Beware the hands that turn without pause, for in their endless motion lies man's forgetting of his own stillness." But it was too late to turn back. The city was in love with rhythm, with precision, with the comfort of ticking. The pulse of Florence was eternal now, shaped not by the heavens, but by human hands that had dared to measure eternity. And sometimes in the deep hours of night, when the bells had long gone silent and the air was heavy with sleep, those who lived near the old cathedral swore they could hear something deeper than sound, a soft hum rising from the stones themselves. It was said to be Matteo's breath, echoing through the gears of time, still reminding the city he had loved. Time is not kept. It keeps you. The centuries that followed carried Florence gently forward, like a river moving under its own quiet momentum. The Renaissance began to bloom, color spilling from canvases, marble taking on human form, ideas rising like dawn over the old medieval walls. But beneath all that beauty, one rhythm remained unchanged, the steady, measured heartbeat of the clocks. In the workshops that lined the narrow streets, time was still being forged by hand. The smell of hot iron oil and beeswax filled the air. Faint smoke curled upward from tiny lamps as craftsmen leaned over benches with their magnifying lenses and trembling tools. They no longer saw themselves as mere artisans. They were guardians of an invisible current, keepers of something both ancient and alive. One of them was a man named Andrea de Manfredi, born nearly a century after Matteo. Andrea had grown up listening to the sound of the cathedral bells, dreaming not of gold or glory, but of rhythm, the perfection of flow. As a boy, he would sit near the Ponte Vecchio, watching the reflection of sunlight flicker on the Arno River, counting how long it took for a ripple to reach a certain stone. He was mesmerized by movement, by the quiet order that seemed to govern the chaos of water and light. When he became an apprentice to a clockmaker, he was unlike any other student. While others focused on accuracy and profit, Andrea listened. He would close his eyes beside a clock and breathe in sync with its pendulum. He said it helped him feel where the time slipped. His master laughed at first, until Andrea repaired a clock that no one else could fix, simply by adjusting its balance wheel by the width of a hair. By the time Andrea reached his 30s, his fame had spread across Italy. Nobles and merchants sought his work, but he refused most commissions. He worked slowly, making only one clock at a time. "If I build too many," he said softly, "time will start to sound like noise." He lived simply, in a small stone house overlooking the city. His workshop faced east, so that the first light of dawn would fall on his tools each morning. The walls were lined with drawings, not just of gears and weights, but of waves, clouds, and human hands. To Andrea, every natural rhythm was a teacher. The sea taught him steadiness. The heart taught him balance. The breath taught him grace. His greatest creation began almost by accident. In the spring of 1492, a scholar from the Medici court visited his workshop. This scholar, Lorenzo di Castello, had been studying the heavens and was obsessed with the precise motion of stars. He wanted a clock that could mark not only the hours of the day, but also the slow procession of the planets, a clock that could hold the sky within its frame. Andrea was reluctant, for such a task would take years, perhaps the rest of his life. But something in the scholar's voice stirred him. "We both chase what moves," Lorenzo said. "You threw gears, I threw stars. Perhaps we should listen together." So the two men began to work. Their collaboration lasted more than a decade. Day after day, Andrea hammered and polished, while Lorenzo calculated, measured, and mapped the heavens. The workshop became a sacred space, part laboratory, part chapel. Charts of constellations hung beside sketches of gear ratios. Candles burned late into the night as the two men argued softly about the nature of time. "Is time a circle?" Lorenzo would ask. "The heavens turn endlessly. Perhaps we do too." Andrea would smile faintly. "A circle, perhaps. But we walk it one heartbeat at a time." Slowly, piece by piece, their creation took shape. It was enormous, taller than a man, with a face of deep blue enamel flecked with gold stars. Around the outer rim rotated brass rings marking the hours, months, and zodiac signs. Within it, tiny planets moved on delicate arms, tracing their orbits as the days passed. At its heart, hidden behind polished oak panels, lay a network of gears so intricate that it seemed to breathe. When at last it was complete, they called it La Macchina del Cielo, the machine of heaven. On the day they unveiled it, the workshop filled with visitors. Scholars, priests, nobles, and even curious children. The moment Andrea wound the great mechanism, silence fell. Slowly, the planets began to turn, the sun gliding smoothly across the dial, casting a faint reflection of gold on the ceiling. The crowd stood in awe. The sound was not harsh or metallic but soft, almost melodic, a whispering rhythm that felt alive. Lorenzo murmured, "It is as if the heavens themselves have bent to our touch." Andrea did not answer. His gaze was distant, his expression unreadable. That night, when the visitors had gone and the candles burned low, Andrea remained alone in the workshop. He watched the planets move, each one following its ordained path. He felt both wonder and unease. Something about the perfection disturbed him. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the brass casing. The machine's warmth pulsed faintly against his palm, almost like a living thing. He whispered, "Are you listening too?" No one knows what happened in the hours that followed. But when Lorenzo returned the next morning, He found Andrea sitting motionless before the clock, his head bowed. The clock was still running perfectly, more perfectly than ever before, yet Andrea seemed far away, lost in its rhythm. When Lorenzo called his name, Andrea stirred slowly, like a man waking from a dream. He looked at his friend and said quietly, "The heavens move without rest, but not without sorrow." Then he smiled faintly and added, "Time has a voice, Lorenzo. It hums when no one speaks." 4 years afterward, La Macchina del Cielo drew visitors from across Europe. Even Leonardo da Vinci is said to have examined it, sketching its inner mechanisms in one of his notebooks. He wrote in the margins, "It is not the machine that moves the heavens, but the heavens that move the machine." And still, through wars, floods, and centuries of silence, the clock endured. Its brass darkened, its enamel faded, but its rhythm never faltered. Even now, hidden within a Florentine museum, it continues to tick, faintly, steadily, a whisper from the age when men first dared to touch eternity. And if you stand before it in the dim museum hall, if you listen long enough, you might feel it too. A subtle vibration beneath your feet, like the earth itself remembering how it once learned to count its own heartbeats. In the years after Andrea de Manfredi's passing, Florence changed once again. The world outside its walls grew louder, faster. Ships set sail toward distant continents. Merchants carried silk from China, sugar from the New World, and rumors of mechanical marvels from far-off lands. Time, once the quiet whisper of bells, became a roar, measured, divided, and sold. Yet in the heart of Florence, hidden behind the thick walls of an old chapel, Andrea's clock still breathed. The machine of heaven, now covered in a soft layer of dust, marked the slow march of the stars. Few people came to see it anymore. The Medici had fallen, scholars turned to new sciences, and yet the mechanism never ceased. It was said that if you entered that dark chapel at midnight, you could still hear it whispering, not the sound of ticking, but a low hum like the faint song of wind through hollow brass. Some called it the breath of time. One cold evening in the early 1600s, a young apprentice named Tommaso Bellini found himself drawn to that sound. He was 17, restless, curious, always building and breaking things. His master, an old silversmith, had told him stories about Andrea de Manfredi, stories of a man who could hear the rhythm of the world. Tommaso laughed at such tales, yet that night, he couldn't sleep. So he crept through the silent streets of Florence, past shuttered shops and the echo of his own footsteps, until he reached the chapel where La Macchina del Cielo slept. The heavy wooden door groaned as he pushed it open. Dust swirled in the lantern light. And there it was, vast, solemn, still beautiful even in decay. The enamel sky had cracked in places, the brass dulled with age. But when Tommaso leaned close, he heard it, that faint, steady hum like a heart too ancient to die. He felt a shiver run through him. "You still live," he whispered. 4 weeks afterward, Tommaso returned every night. He cleaned the gears, oiled the axles, polished the tarnished face. He studied its workings in silence, as if afraid that speaking aloud might wake something too sacred to name. Slowly, he began to understand Andrea's craft, not just the mechanical precision, but the poetry within it. One evening, as he adjusted the balance arm, he noticed something strange. A small marking engraved beneath the brass casing, so faint it was nearly invisible. He wiped away the dust and read the words, "Non il tempo ma l'ascolto." Not time, but the listening. He felt his pulse quicken. What had Andrea meant? That night, Tommaso began keeping notes. Sketches, calculations, fragments of thought. He wrote about the hum of the clock, about how it seemed to change with the weather, how its rhythm sometimes slowed, as if breathing in the moonlight. He even began to dream of it, dreams where the gears turned endlessly, and he floated between them, weightless, timeless. But word of his obsession spread. His master warned him, "Be careful, boy. Florence has forgotten such dreams. The world now runs by profit, not poetry." Still, Tommaso couldn't stop. He wanted to uncover what Andrea had hidden. One night, he took apart the central axis, a task no one had dared before. Inside, instead of the usual pinions and springs, he found something unexpected. A hollow brass sphere, no larger than a walnut, sealed with wax. Carefully he cracked it open. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle. On it were just a few lines written in Andrea's hand. When the rhythm of the stars meets the rhythm of the heart, the machine will remember. Below it, a tiny drawing, the outline of a pendulum shaped like a flame. Tommaso stared at it for a long time. The words made no sense. And yet, he felt something stir inside him. A strange awareness, as if he were being watched not by eyes, but by time itself. He replaced the parchment carefully and closed the casing. But that night, when he wound the clock again, something changed. The hum deepened. The brass sphere within began to resonate softly, like the note of a tuning fork. And then, for just an instant, the entire face of the clock shimmered. The stars engraved upon it seemed to glow faintly, as if lit from within. Tommaso stepped back, breathless. The air felt charged, alive. He heard, or thought he heard, a whisper. "Listen." He ran from the chapel, terrified yet entranced. From that night onward, the clock's hum grew slightly louder. Some claimed that its rhythm no longer matched the hours of ordinary clocks, that it ran slower, deeper, as if counting something unseen. Tommaso continued his visits in secret. He brought with him scholars, alchemists, and musicians, all drawn by curiosity. Some said the machine responded differently to each person, that if you stood near it long enough, its sound would match your heartbeat. One night, a visiting astronomer, Signora Isabella Conti, placed her hand on the clock and gasped. "It's following my pulse," she whispered. "It knows I'm here." The others laughed nervously, but Tommaso only nodded. He had felt it too. Together they began an experiment. They placed tuning forks of different frequencies near the machine, testing its vibrations. To their astonishment, the gears within shifted slightly whenever a particular tone, the note E minor, was played. It was as if the machine were singing back. Over the months that followed, the group of secret listeners grew. They met in the chapel after midnight, calling themselves Gli Orologii Silenziosi, the silent clockmakers. They believed that Andrea had built more than a clock. He had built a bridge, a living instrument that connected human perception with a celestial rhythm. But not everyone was pleased. Word began to spread through Florence of strange gatherings in the old chapel, of people who listened to the stars. The church grew suspicious. "There is only one divine order," said the bishop. "To claim that man can commune with the heavens is heresy." One dawn, guards arrived to seal the chapel. The silent clockmakers scattered. Some were arrested. Tommaso fled into the hills carrying Andrea's parchment hidden beneath his shirt. No one knows exactly what became of him. Some say he crossed the Alps and continued his experiments in Prague. Others believe he vanished into legend, taking with him the secret frequency of the machine of heaven. But the chapel remained, locked, silent, forgotten. The hum faded, the dust thickened, and yet, beneath it all, deep inside the brass and oak, something still moved, slowly, patiently, waiting for someone who could hear. It was nearly a century later, in the soft dawn of the 1700s, that Florence began to stir once again with curiosity about the mysteries of time. The city had changed. The Medici grandeur had dimmed, and new ideas, born of reason and experiment, filled the air. In candlelit rooms, philosophers argued about the nature of motion and the laws of gravity, quoting Newton in hushed tones. But among the city's oldest families, whispers still persisted, about a machine that breathed, a clock that could listen. The tale of La Macchina del Cielo had become something between a myth and a lullaby. Mothers told it to children on rainy nights. Scholars dismissed it as superstition. Yet, in a narrow street behind the Piazza della Signoria, an old watchmaker named Maestro Riccardo Verani kept a small shop filled with ticking hearts of brass. His tools were worn smooth by decades of use. His spectacles clouded with the patina of time. And though he sold watches to nobles and priests, Ricardo's passion lay not in trade, but in understanding. One evening, as the light faded through the shop's window, a young student entered, a woman named Lucia Bartoli, studying natural philosophy at the university. She carried with her a bundle of sketches, blueprints of intricate gearwork she had copied from old manuscripts. "Maestro," she said softly, "I found something strange in the library. A drawing of a pendulum shaped like a flame." Ricardo looked up sharply. "A flame, you say?" She unrolled the parchment. There it was, a familiar form, the very same design Tommaso Bellini had once found. Beneath it, faintly written, "Non il tempo ma l'ascolto." The old man's hands trembled. "Where did you find this?" "In a box marked Bellini. The records say he was a craftsman, once apprenticed to a silversmith, vanished in 1608. Ricardo removed his spectacles and stared into the fading light. "I knew his name," he murmured. "My grandfather spoke of him, said he was mad or perhaps a prophet. They said he built a clock that could feel." That night Lucia and Ricardo talked for hours. She showed him the old mechanical notes she'd copied, fragments of astronomical ratios, sound frequencies, and sketches of a great wheel inscribed with constellations. Ricardo listened in silence, then rose and opened a drawer at the back of his shop. Inside lay a small brass cog, curved and delicate like a petal. "This," he said, "was found near the ruins of an old chapel. My grandfather said it came from the breath of time itself." They examined it under the lamplight. The engraving on the rim was unmistakable, a small star surrounded by an ear-shaped curve, the symbol of the listener. Lucia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you think it's real?" Ricardo smiled faintly. "Child, everything is real until it stops being remembered." Within weeks, the two began to reconstruct the lost mechanism, piecing together Tommaso's drawings and Ricardo's inherited fragments. They worked in secret after the shop closed, the ticking of small watches replaced by the groaning turn of old gears. Lucia would often hum softly while working, matching the rhythm of the pendulum. She said it helped her think. Ricardo noticed that the machine seemed to respond, the gears aligning more smoothly whenever her voice filled the room. One night, as they adjusted the final segment of the escapement wheel, a faint vibration rippled through the air. Lucia froze. "Did you feel that?" Ricardo nodded slowly. "Keep humming." She continued, a low, steady tone, somewhere between a hum and a sigh. The brass disc quivered, almost imperceptibly. Then, from within the mechanism came a sound. A low, resonant hum that harmonized with her voice, a deep echo that seemed to come from the metal itself. They stared at one another. "It's singing back," Lucia breathed. When the hum faded, they were silent for a long while. Finally, Ricardo whispered, This is what Andrea heard." From that night, they devoted themselves fully to awakening the machine. Lucia began taking notes on how sound waves might affect the movement of pendulums. She studied the relationship between resonance and gravity, how vibration might amplify precision. Ricardo, meanwhile, refined the gears with obsessive care. Their work became a quiet ritual. Each evening, as the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore tolled midnight, they would wind the mechanism and hum softly together, the shop filled with the sound of metal breathing. But as the months passed, Lucia noticed something strange. The longer they worked, the slower all the other clocks in the shop seemed to run. The difference was small at first, a second here, a second there, but it grew. She checked and rechecked, replaced springs, recalibrated balance wheels, but the effect remained. "It's as if time itself bends around it," she whispered. Ricardo only nodded, eyes heavy with both awe and fear. "The machine does not keep time," he said. "It makes it." Then one winter's night, as the Arno River froze over, the machine fell silent. The hum was gone. Lucia panicked, turning gears, adjusting weights. Nothing. Ricardo leaned close and whispered, "Perhaps it is listening." They waited. 4 hours. The candles burned low. Outside, snow drifted softly against the windows. And then when the last candle flickered out, they heard it. Faint at first, then stronger. A single rhythmic beat like a slow heartbeat. It wasn't the sound of the machine. It was their own heartbeats, perfectly synchronized. Lucia closed her eyes. The room felt weightless. In that suspended silence, she felt the strange truth Andrea had written centuries before. That time was not a line, nor a circle, but a rhythm that lived in both the stars and the soul. When the sound faded, Ricardo whispered, "You've done it. You've made time listen again." But the next morning, when Lucia returned to the shop, Ricardo was gone. The door stood open, snow melting in footprints that led nowhere. Only his spectacles remained, resting beside the still machine. The city awoke that winter to strange whispers. Some said Maestro Ricardo had vanished into thin air. Others claimed he had crossed into another century. There were even those who swore that, on the night of his disappearance, all the clocks in Florence had stopped for exactly one heartbeat. A silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lucia tried to ignore the rumors. She returned every night to the shop, winding the mechanism, listening for the hum. But without Ricardo's calm presence, the room felt hollow. The machine sat motionless, silent, unresponsive. Weeks passed. Dust gathered on the brass like frost on forgotten glass. One evening, Lucia sat before it with trembling hands, whispering, "If you can hear me, if you remember," and began to hum again. The tone was softer now, fragile, like a prayer for someone lost. Nothing. She sighed, her breath clouding the cold air. Then, as she reached to extinguish the lamp, a faint tremor ran through the floorboards. The gears twitched. Slowly, deliberately, the great pendulum began to sway. Once, twice, and then the hum returned, deeper than before, fuller. Lucia froze. The sound was different now, more human somehow. Beneath the mechanical tone, she thought she heard another layer. A whisper, stretched and blurred, almost like words forming from inside the metal. She leaned closer. "Ricardo!" The whisper deepened, and for an instant, she could have sworn she heard her own name. She stumbled backward, heart pounding. The hum continued, steady, unbothered, as if it had simply acknowledged her presence and then moved beyond her. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the Arno, the city lights trembling on the water. In her notebook she wrote, "If the machine listens, perhaps it remembers. Perhaps Ricardo is not gone, but elsewhere." Within days, word spread among scholars again. This time, not whispers but curiosity. Professors from Pisa, from Padua, even from Paris came to see the so-called living clock. They crowded into Ricardo's dim shop, their voices hushed with awe as Lucia demonstrated the mechanism. The hum filled the air like the tone of a cathedral organ. One French physicist declared, "This is resonance beyond our instruments. It reacts to emotion. When you hum in fear, it slows. When you hum in joy, it brightens." They called it l'orologio anima, the soul clock. Soon, Florence buzzed with fascination once more. Painters sketched it, poets wrote of it, and philosophers debated whether it proved that time itself was conscious. Lucia, meanwhile, felt both wonder and dread. Every night, after the crowds left, she sat alone before the machine, tracing its curves with her fingertips, feeling its faint vibration. She began to dream again. In her sleep, she saw Ricardo, standing among gears as vast as towers, light bending around him like glass. He would smile but never speak. Only when she woke did she realize the rhythm of her own heart was echoing the hum she had heard in the dream. By spring, the soul clock had become more than a curiosity. Wealthy patrons offered gold to buy it, to display in palaces. But Lucia refused. "It's not a possession," she said quietly. "It's a listener." Still the church was uneasy. Rumors reached the bishop's hall that people claimed to commune with the machine, seeking answers from its rhythm. Superstition, they said, was creeping back into a city that prided itself on science. One dusk, two clerics arrived unannounced at the shop. Lucia greeted them politely, but their expressions were cold. "This device," one said, "has become an idol. It distracts men from prayer and bends their hearts toward strange faiths. It must be dismantled. Her voice trembled. You don't understand, it's not a god. It's a memory. They gave her a week. Then they would return with authority. That night, Lucia sat by the machine until dawn, the candlelight soft against the brass. Her thoughts tangled between fear and determination. She whispered, "They'll take you apart. If you can hear me, tell me what to do." The pendulum shifted. A low, steady beat filled the room. Then, faintly, she heard the hum form into something almost like a word. Ascolta. Listen. And then she understood. She gathered her notebooks, sketches, Ricardo's old notes, and a small travel case. With trembling care, she dismantled part of the mechanism, not to destroy it, but to preserve its heart. Inside the casing was the brass sphere, the same Andrea had sealed centuries earlier, the one Tommaso had opened. She wrapped it in linen and left the shop before sunrise. By the time the clerics arrived, the soul clock was silent once more, its breath gone, its rhythm stilled. Lucia vanished from Florence. Some said she fled to Venice, others that she boarded a ship bound for France. But witnesses claimed that the night she left, as her carriage crossed the Ponte Vecchio, all the clocks in Florence struck the same note. Not in time, but in harmony, ringing once, and then falling silent for exactly the span of one heartbeat. And in that moment, the city seemed to remember its oldest secret. That time in Florence had once been born not from numbers or gears, but from the simple act of listening. The years slipped by like candle wax, soft and irreversible. Florence moved on, as cities always do, its bells ringing again in ordinary rhythm. But the legend of Lucia Bartoli and the soul clock refused to fade. In Parisian cafés, men in powdered wigs whispered of the woman who made time breathe. In Venice, sailors swore they had seen her on the docks, carrying a small brass sphere that glowed faintly at dusk. Some said she was bound for London. Others said she vanished into the Alps, chasing an echo that only she could hear. By the 1750s, Europe had entered the age of precision. Watchmakers, inspired by Newton and Galileo, competed to build the most accurate marine chronometers, instruments that could tell longitude and conquer oceans. Yet amid the measured pride of science, there lingered the strange rumor of an older kind of time, one that could feel. In a workshop near Geneva, a young inventor named Etienne Rousseau, a name whispered later among horologists, came across a faded notebook at an antique stall. The cover bore the initials LB, and inside were careful sketches of oscillating gears, annotated with poetic phrases rather than equations. Beside one drawing of a pendulum shaped like a flame were the words, "When matter hums, it remembers." Etienne was fascinated. He had spent years studying resonance and vibration, believing that sound could affect the accuracy of a mechanism. These notes seemed to describe precisely that, but from a mind centuries ahead of its time. He began to experiment. In the quiet hours of the night, when Geneva slept, he tuned his clocks to the faint vibrations of tuning forks. He discovered that certain frequencies, when sustained, reduced friction and increased regularity. It was as if the metal wanted to move in harmony with the sound. He became obsessed. He lined his workbench with pendulums of varying shapes, teardrops, spheres, and one small flame-shaped piece, built exactly as the drawing suggested. When he set it in motion, it oscillated with perfect rhythm. One evening, as snow fell against the shutters, Etienne wound his latest creation and let it swing freely. He struck a tuning fork in the note of E minor, the same tone Tommaso Bellini had once used, and the clock responded. Not with sound at first, but with light. A faint shimmer ran through the metal, almost invisible but unmistakable. The pendulum seemed to catch the glow of the candle flame, bending it slightly, as if absorbing it. Etienne felt his skin prickle. He whispered, "What are you?" And for a heartbeat, or perhaps for 1,000 years, there was silence. Then deep inside the gears came a low hum. It wasn't a mechanical vibration. It was something deeper, a tone that felt like it resonated inside his chest. He dropped the tuning fork, stepping back. The hum grew faint, then faded entirely. Etienne spent the rest of that night studying every note in Lucia's journal. He found sketches of a chapel, fragments of coordinates, and a passage written in hurried Latin. When the listener forgets himself, the machine will awaken. He underlined the words twice. Weeks later, Etienne traveled to Italy. His letters from that time, later discovered in an attic in Geneva, describe a pilgrimage through crumbling villages and overgrown paths, searching for a chapel that listens. He spoke of following the sound of bells that weren't there, of feeling watched by the very rhythm of the earth. And then his letters stopped. Months passed before anyone heard of him again. But in late summer, a shepherd near the Tuscan hills claimed to have seen a strange light at the ruins of an old church. He described it as a star inside a clock, breathing. When locals went to investigate, they found the chapel's door ajar. Inside, amid vines and dust, stood a small mechanism, unfamiliar yet ancient. It was a clock, yes, but more than that. Its brass plates were etched with celestial markings, and from its center hung a pendulum shaped unmistakably like a flame. On the wall behind it, scratched into the stone, was a single word: Ascolta. The villagers, frightened, sealed the place once more. But word spread quickly. Artists and mystics began to travel to Florence again, hoping to glimpse the legendary Macchina del Cielo reborn. Poets wrote that time itself hums beneath Tuscany. By the dawn of the 19th century, the myth had taken on new life. Philosophers debated whether the clock was metaphor or miracle. Some argued that Andrea de Manfredi's creation had been the first step toward uniting art and science, the rhythm of nature captured in motion. Others said it was only a story, a dream passed down by those who wanted to believe that machines could feel. Yet every few decades someone, a traveler, a monk, a lost child, claimed to hear a hum coming from the hills east of Florence. They described it as warm, deep, like the sound of the sea within a shell. No one could ever find the source. In time, the memory of Andrea, Tommaso, Lucia, and Etienne blurred together, a lineage of listeners, each hearing the same silent pulse that threaded through centuries. The world had moved on to railways, telegraphs, and factory whistles, each demanding obedience to its own mechanical tick. But beneath all that precision, Florence remained the city where time had first been heard. And even now, the locals say that when the night is clear and the Arno is still, if you stand at the edge of the old quarter and close your eyes, you can hear it faintly, a hum older than history itself. The nights of Florence deepened with an almost sacred silence, yet that silence was never complete. Beneath the breath of the Arno, under the low hum of the wind that curved around the Duomo, there was a rhythmic murmur, a pulse of iron and will. It came from the workshops of the clockmakers. Inside, candles flickered and wax dripped slowly, marking their own form of time. Here, men bent over their benches, their eyes ringed with sleepless devotion. The sound of the metal files whispered like sandpaper against the centuries. Each rasp, each gentle tap, was an act of patience against chaos. In one such workshop, beside the shadowed bell tower of Santa Croce, an aging master named Tommaso de Sarti moved his trembling hands with a kind of reverence. His beard was silvered like frost, his eyes small lanterns of thought. He was shaping a new escapement, one that would make his name endure beyond his death. Around him were the tools of his life, worn wooden handles, tiny cogs, coils of wire, and a small crucifix that leaned near the window. Outside, the bells told the canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, but Tommaso no longer trusted them. They were still the old way, he thought, the voice of monks and suns and shadows. His time would be the new kind, time that moved because a human mind had made it so. In those same years, across the city, other craftsmen were awakening to the same idea. Giovanni di Dondi, known later for his astronomical clock in Padua, wrote letters filled with wonder and calculation. He described the heavens turning with invisible gears and dreamed of a clock that could mimic that celestial harmony. Time in their minds was no longer divine. It was mechanical, reproducible, and measurable. Florence, Venice, Padua, and Milan. These cities were becoming laboratories of rhythm. But not everyone welcomed it. There were whispers among the clergy that these new machines were intrusions into the sacred order. Time had belonged to God. To measure it so precisely, some said, was to challenge creation itself. Sermons warned against men who bind the hours as if they were slaves. Yet, in secret, even monasteries began commissioning their own clocks. The bells had to ring exactly at vespers, exactly at compline, exactly at dawn. And so, the clockmakers worked, both condemned and desired. By 1344, Florence had become one of the first cities to mount a mechanical clock on its public tower. The crowd gathered below, murmuring in awe as the hammer struck the bell not by hand, but by an unseen mechanism. The hour rang true and cold, echoing through narrow alleys like a prophecy. A young boy watching that day was said to have whispered, "Even the angels must now listen to men." Inside the guild halls, the masters of iron debated standards. Should a day be divided by 24 hours, as the ancients had said, or by equal ones, measured by the turning of gears? It was not only a matter of science but of trade, of money, of power. Merchants needed accuracy for contracts and fares. Shipbuilders needed precision for tides and travel. Time was no longer prayer, it was profit. By night, when Florence slept, the apprentices walked through empty piazzas counting the strikes of the bells. They recorded the intervals, checking the alignment with water clocks or sundials, adjusting by fractions of heartbeats. Each correction was a victory, each mistake a lesson. The smell of hot metal mixed with the perfume of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens. In those dim hours, time seemed to breathe. Sometimes, Tommaso would pause and simply listen. The sound of his unfinished clock was faint but steady, a tick barely audible, like the breathing of a newborn child. He would close his eyes and imagine the day it would be mounted on a tower, its gears turning in the sunlight, declaring to the world that humanity had captured something once beyond reach. It was both pride and fear, a sense of touching the divine through craft. Florence itself seemed to move differently after that. People began to meet by the clock, not by the sun. Shopkeepers opened their doors at precise moments. Bells no longer called for prayers only. They signaled the beginning of trade, the changing of shifts, the order of daily life. The rhythm of Florence became mechanical, the city itself a vast, breathing timepiece. In the midst of this, the Black Death swept through Italy, darkening the streets and silencing the clocks. Time stopped in a way. The hands of the craftsmen froze, and so did their hearts. Yet, even amid despair, those who survived returned to their benches. They understood now that to mark time was to resist death. Every tick, every strike of the bell was a defiance, a reminder that humanity continued. And so, the art of timekeeping became sacred in another way. It was not the sacredness of churches or relics, but of endurance. To measure a moment was to prove existence. The clockmakers of Florence worked with this quiet faith, their faces illuminated by lamplight, their tools whispering the eternal dialogue between man and time. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, even now in the old quarters of Florence, you can hear the faint echo of those hammers. They are not just sounds of work. They are prayers in metal, rhythm of lives devoted to something larger than themselves. The walls remember. The bells remember. The air remembers. The bells of Florence rang differently now. Less for devotion, more for discipline. Each chime carried the promise of order, and the echo of human mastery. The great towers, Santa Maria del Fiore, Palazzo Vecchio, and the churches that speckled the skyline, seemed to breathe in unison with their clocks. As dawn broke, the first light slipped over terracotta roofs, brushing across the dials that gleamed faintly with dew. The hands moved gently, almost shyly, but the city stirred because of them. Markets opened, bakers lit their ovens, scribes unfolded their parchment. Time had become the quiet ruler of Florence. In the workshops, the clockmakers felt that shift most intimately. They had built a creature they could not quite control. Gears, once obedient, now seemed to dictate their lives. "We created time," one of them murmured, "and now it owns us." Their work was endless. Each new mechanism demanded another improvement, another experiment, another sleepless night. The men who had once shaped hours now found themselves enslaved by minutes. Yet there was beauty in that surrender. Among them was a younger artisan, Matteo di Baroni, who had studied under Tommaso de Sarti before the master's death. Matteo carried Tommaso's notes everywhere. A small bound book of measurements, ideas, and sketches filled with cryptic annotations like Tempo respira, time breathes. Matteo was different from his teacher. His hands were steady but impatient. His imagination restless. He wanted not just accuracy but elegance. To him, a clock was not only an instrument but a poem made of brass and silence. Matteo's ambition grew into obsession. He sought to create a timepiece that could run for a year without winding, a near-miraculous dream for the 14th century. He worked in secret, refusing visitors. His small workshop filled with a faint odor of oil and metal filings. His only companion was the ticking heart of his unfinished machine. Neighbors would sometimes hear him talking softly to it, as though to a living thing. "You will not betray me," he would whisper. "You will remember every second I've given you." Side Florence was changing. The Medici family was beginning to rise, their wealth reshaping the very rhythm of the city. Banking houses demanded precise timekeeping for contracts that stretched across nations. Caravans leaving for Bruges or London needed synchronization with church bells and sundials. The humble work of clockmakers had become the hidden skeleton of commerce and empire. But in the shadows, rivalries brewed. Other workshops competed fiercely, stealing apprentices and spying on designs. Precision was power, and power was dangerous. Matteo once caught an intruder rummaging through his tools. It was another clockmaker's apprentice, sent to sketch the shape of Matteo's new escapement. He didn't call for help. He simply stared at the boy until he fled, leaving behind a single note. "Florence is listening." It was true. Florence listened. The city itself seemed to lean closer to the whispers of invention. Guild meetings grew heated. Secrets passed between hands like coins. Who had the most stable balance wheel? Who had achieved the perfect swing of the pendulum before the world even knew the term? Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said Matteo had built a clock that could tell not only the hour but the motion of the stars. Others said his clock had stopped at the moment his heart did. One winter's evening, as the snow fell softly across the Piazza della Signoria, Matteo's workshop window glowed faintly. Inside, he sat alone beside his finished clock. It was small, beautiful, and impossibly intricate. Tiny silver hands, delicate inscriptions, and a heartbeat that pulsed with invisible energy. He wound it once, and it began to move, smoothly, flawlessly. Matteo smiled faintly, but in his eyes there was fear. He had touched something eternal, something that no man should own. He wrote in his journal that night, "When the wheel turns, I feel it in my chest. Tick is my blood. The spring is my soul wound tight. I wonder, when it stops, will I?" No one saw Matteo again after that winter. Some said he left for Venice. Some said he died in his sleep beside his creation. But the clock remained, found years later by another craftsman, still ticking, still perfect. Its gears had not rusted, its rhythm unchanged. It was as if time itself refused to let go of the man who had given it form. The story of Matteo spread quietly among the clockmakers, passed from one generation to the next. They would whisper about the breathing clock of Florence, the one that kept its own pulse. Scholars dismissed it as myth. Yet every craftsman who heard it worked with a little more reverence afterward, a little more care, as if they too were touching something that might remember them long after they were gone. Florence moved on, its towers taller, its bells louder. But deep in the workshops, the old rhythm continued. The soft rasp of metal, the careful grinding of gears, the breath between ticks. The men who worked there no longer believed they were merely marking hours. They were shaping the silence between them. The centuries slipped by as softly as dust over stone, and Florence aged like a face remembered through mist. The sound of its bells changed tone with the passing generations, yet the heartbeat of time, born in the minds and hands of its clockmakers, never truly faltered. The Arno flowed beneath the bridges, slow and indifferent, while men continued to measure the immeasurable. By the dawn of the 15th century, the clockmaker's art had become both revered and feared. The guilds had grown powerful, their workshops guarded like sanctuaries. No apprentice was allowed to see a master's plans in full. Each new escapement, each refinement in the balance of weight and wheel, was treated as sacred revelation. Within their walls, craftsmen still whispered the legend of Matteo di Baroni, the man who had built a clock that breathed. They called it il respiro del tempo, the breath of time. Many sought to find it. None succeeded. Yet, it haunted their dreams, driving them toward greater invention. Time had become not just a measure. It was a pursuit, a philosophy, a mirror of man's hunger to control what he could not touch. Florence in those years was a place of contradictions. Art and war, devotion and greed, beauty and calculation. Leonardo da Vinci was a boy then, wandering the city's streets, watching the craftsmen work, sketching their tools, their gears, their water-driven mills. He would later write in his notebooks, "The wheel of time turns by the hand of man, yet man is turned by it also." Perhaps he had heard of Matteo's clock. Perhaps the story planted a quiet seed in his mind. Inside the workshops, the air was thick with the scent of oil and iron filings. The glow of lanterns fell across the metal teeth of gears like sunlight across bones. Masters sat hunched, adjusting minute imperfections, their ears tuned to sounds no one else could hear. The tick of a test wheel, the faintest friction of metal against metal. It was music, delicate and exacting. Each tool had its own history, passed down from hands long gone. Some hammers had shaped time for nearly 100 years. The bells of the Palazzo Vecchio still rang out over the city, calling not to prayer now, but to commerce. The rhythm of Florence had become mechanical, ordered, precise. Even the painters seemed to echo that new sense of balance. Giotto's geometry, Brunelleschi's perspective, the measured proportions of the human body. The Florentine mind was learning to see the world as a great mechanism, divine yet mechanical, infinite yet measurable. There was something almost holy in their obsession. One visitor to a workshop in 1420 wrote, "These men speak to brass as priests to angels. They believe their work shall outlast kingdoms." And perhaps it did. For every hour struck by their creations was another heartbeat in the long body of civilization. In those same years, a certain clockmaker named Lorenzo Capponi began working on a tower clock for the Cathedral of Florence. His design was daring. Instead of showing time by the motion of a single hand, it moved in reverse, tracing the ancient Italian hours that ended at sunset. The clergy approved, saying it reminded men that all light must fade. But the citizens found it unsettling. To watch time retreat was to feel one's life unwinding backward. Still, the clock was completed, and when it rang for the first time, its deep voice rolled over the rooftops like thunder. The people stared, unsure whether to rejoice or fear. Lorenzo stood below, his hands trembling. He had made a thing that told not the time of man, but the time of God, the ending of days in every day. And yet, when he walked home that night, the stars above seemed to move differently, as if acknowledging what he had done. Florence continued to grow in wealth and art, yet beneath that brilliance was a strange, quiet melancholy. To measure every second was to feel its loss. Timekeeping had given man order, but had also taught him the cost of precision. The same bells that marked the hour of work also marked the hour of death. There is a record of an anonymous monk writing in 1445, "We live now by the clock. The sun still rises, yet we wait for iron to tell us so." His words drifted through centuries, echoing the paradox that Florence had created, a world more exact but perhaps less free. And still, the clockmakers labored on. The younger generation had begun experimenting with smaller, portable mechanisms. Time was leaving the towers and entering homes. Merchants carried pocket clocks. Noblemen wore them on chains. The sound of ticking followed them everywhere, a constant whisper of mortality disguised as progress. When spring returned to Florence, the city glowed again. Painters mixed new shades of gold, the river shimmered with sunlight, and from the bell towers came that eternal voice, steady, patient, unfeeling. The citizens moved to its command, never knowing that deep beneath their ordered lives, the men who had made time were themselves trapped by it, forever winding, forever measuring, forever listening. In one forgotten room, hidden beneath the arches of the old quarter, a broken clock still ticked faintly. Its gears were rusted, its face darkened by smoke, yet the sound continued, soft, uncertain, human. The apprentices who discovered it swore it breathed, faintly like a sleeping thing. They could not repair it, nor could they destroy it. So they left it there, under a cloth, whispering a prayer as they closed the door. Outside, Florence moved forward, but under its stones, something ancient and ticking remained, reminding the earth that once, men had dared to make time itself their servant. The spring of Florence unfolded slowly, as though the city itself were savoring the minutes it had learned to control. The smell of bread drifted through narrow alleys. The sunlight washed over marble statues and half-finished frescoes. The sound of water trickled through the fountains like a reminder that not all motion could be measured. Yet even in this calm, the pulse of time never stopped. The bells of the Duomo rang like the breathing of the city, steady, immense, and unyielding. In the years that followed, the mastery of the Florentine clockmakers began to spread beyond Italy. Their designs were copied, refined, carried by merchants and scholars to France, to England, to the cities of the north. Time, once born in the hands of a few quiet craftsmen, was now a force that moved empires. The art of the escapement, perfected in hidden workshops near the Arno, became the language of the world's rhythm. But with that fame came something colder. The intimacy of the craft began to fade. Large workshops replaced small ones. Wealthy patrons demanded clocks as symbols of power, their dials encrusted with gold and enamel, their bells louder and more ornate. For the new generation, time was not devotion, it was display. The heartbeat that Tommaso and Matteo had once felt in their gears was replaced by the clatter of commerce. Still, there were a few who remembered. Among them was a widow's son named Pietro Alfani, who had found, by pure accident, the broken clock left behind beneath the old arches of the city. He was a humble craftsman, too poor to afford fine tools, too proud to stop trying. The clock fascinated him. It was small, no bigger than a melon, its hands carved like tiny feathers, its frame of darkened brass. When Pietro touched it, he thought he felt warmth. For nights he sat beside it, studying its ancient design. The gears were unlike any he had seen. Subtle, balanced, almost alive. He tried to repair it, but every attempt failed. Still he couldn't let it go. He began dreaming of it, hearing its faint ticking in his sleep. Once, he woke before dawn and swore he heard it breathing in the corner of his room. He returned to the guild to ask if anyone knew its maker. The elders smiled, almost wistfully. That, one said, is the work of Matteo di Baroni, the man who gave time a soul. Pietro felt his skin chill. He had heard the stories but never believed them. And now the clock sat in his hands, quietly ticking through centuries of dust. He worked on it for months, not for money or fame, but for understanding. Each time he adjusted a wheel or polished a spring, he felt something shift inside him. The rhythm of the mechanism began to match his own heartbeat. He stopped noticing the passing of days. He ate when hungry, slept when exhausted, but always returned to the same sound, the delicate, steady pulse that filled his workshop. The city outside had grown louder, faster, more crowded. The Renaissance had arrived in full bloom. Painters and philosophers debated the soul, geometry, light, and motion, but Pietro cared only for the motion he could hear. He would tell those who visited, "A clock is not a machine, it is a prayer that never ends." They would smile politely, not understanding. One evening, when the rain fell hard over the tiled roofs, Pietro made the final adjustment. The clock, long silent, began to move freely again. The tick grew stronger, then steadier, like a small living creature awakening from sleep. Pietro sat in the glow of the candlelight and listened. It was the same rhythm as before, only gentler, almost human. He leaned close, closed his eyes and whispered, "Welcome back." Outside, the storm passed, leaving the city washed and quiet. From the towers came the sound of bells marking the hour, but Pietro's clock did not follow them. It struck once, softly, as if marking its own time, apart from all others. Pietro smiled faintly. He wrote one sentence in his journal before falling asleep beside it. It no longer obeys the city. Perhaps time remembers itself. When his neighbors found him the next morning, the candle had burned out. Pietro was still seated, peaceful, as if dreaming. The clock was ticking steadily beside him, its hands unmoving, frozen forever at the hour he had died. News spread quietly through the guild, and for a while, the old fears returned. The breathing clock had taken another maker, they said. Some called it cursed, others divine. The elders sealed it away once more, deep within the archives of the cathedral, where no one would disturb it again. Yet even there, beneath layers of stone and silence, it kept ticking, softly, patiently, eternally. Above, the city thrived. Painters painted, bankers traded, lovers met beneath balconies, and the bells of Florence continued to call the hours. None of them knew that under their feet, hidden in shadow, the oldest clock in the world still breathed, a secret heartbeat under the rhythm of civilization. The centuries drifted on, folding one over another like pages in a book written by unseen hands. Florence changed its face. Its narrow alleys filled with merchants from faraway lands, its markets bloomed with silk and spices, and its towers grew pale with age. The Medici had come and gone, painters had risen and vanished, and yet, somewhere beneath the marble floors of the cathedral, time itself continued its quiet confession. Dust gathered over forgotten ledgers. Candles burned down to stubs. Generations of priests and keepers passed without knowing what lay sealed in the deep vault below, the small brass clock that refused to die. When the cathedral bell struck midnight, the faintest echo would stir below the stone, a sound softer than breath, almost like a sigh. Those who worked late swore they felt the floor tremble, as if something beneath were listening. In the 17th century, when Florence had turned its eyes to science, a young scholar named Antonio Bardi discovered the mention of Matteo di Baroni in a faded manuscript. The story fascinated him. A clock that could run for centuries, a machine that seemed to have a soul. He searched the archives, his lantern lighting centuries of dust, until one night he found a small sealed door near the cathedral crypt. Took him hours to open it. What he found inside was no myth. It was the clock, untouched, faintly glimmering in the dark. It was still ticking. Antonio knelt beside it, awed. The mechanism was unlike anything he had ever studied. Too advanced for its time, too perfect. He disassembled it carefully, piece by piece, recording every spring and gear. But when he tried to reassemble it, something strange happened. It would not move again. He tried for days, then weeks. Each time he failed. He felt the weight of centuries pressing on his chest. Finally, one night, exhausted, he rested his head beside the motionless device and drifted into uneasy sleep. In his dream, he heard a voice, soft, distant, like the turning of wheels in mist. It said, "You cannot rebuild what remembers you." He woke with a start. The clock was ticking again, slowly, rhythmically, though no one had touched it. The sound filled the chamber, warm and alive. Antonio stepped back, trembling. He wrote in his notes, "This clock obeys no man, chooses when to wake. It may not measure hours but hearts." After that night, Antonio sealed the vault once more. He never spoke of it publicly. His notebooks were filed away among church records, forgotten until long after his death. But sometimes, late at night, the priests heard faint echoes through the cathedral floors, the whisper of gears turning beneath their prayers. Time continued its relentless march. The Renaissance became memory. The machines of the modern age arrived with steam and smoke. Florence learned new rhythms. the hiss of trains, the hum of electricity, the chatter of tourists in the piazzas. But in that hidden chamber, the rhythm remained unchanged. The clock still breathed. In the 19th century, when the cathedral underwent renovation, workers clearing the lower vaults uncovered a strange sound in the silence. They thought it was dripping water until they followed it to a small iron door. When they opened it, they found the ancient clock sitting on a cracked marble pedestal, its brass worn smooth but shining faintly in the dim light. It was still running. The men stood in awe, crosses forming instinctively in their hands. One of them whispered, "It's alive!" A scholar from Pisa examined it and declared it impossible. No mechanism of this age should still move, he said. But when he tried to stop it, by gently lifting its weights, the gears resisted him, as though something invisible refused his touch. "Perhaps it has wound itself," another murmured. "Or perhaps it no longer needs to." They closed the vault again, uneasy. Years passed, and the story faded once more, becoming local legend. Tourists would sometimes hear it from old guides who whispered of il nascosto di Firenze, the hidden heart of Florence. Most smiled politely, taking it for a fairy tale. But the locals knew. They would say, "Listen at midnight near the cathedral steps, and you'll hear it. A faint ticking beneath the stones." And if you stood there, truly still, with your breath held and your heart slowed, sometimes you could hear it indeed. A soft, irregular rhythm, like something remembering you from long ago. Above it, the city glittered in electric light. The bells of the Duomo still marked the hours, their tones mingling with the sound of footsteps and laughter. Time had become fast now, almost impatient. Watches ticked on wrists, clocks glowed in windows. Seconds turned to data, data into light. Yet beneath all that noise, the ancient pulse of Florence remained, deep and steady, untouched. No one has opened the lower vault since. The church says it is sealed for restoration, but the truth is simpler. Those who go down there do not wish to disturb it. For every clock that runs, there must be one that listens. Every measure of time begins with silence, and ends in it. And so, even now, beneath the marble bones of the city, the first true breath of time continues. Patient, unbroken, eternal. The streets of Florence had grown quieter by the late hours of the night. The air was still heavy with the scent of cooling metal and burnt oil from the workshops that had worked tirelessly through the day. Inside one small, dimly lit room near the Piazza della Signoria, the last of the clockmakers sat in silence, watching the pendulum sway back and forth. It was a moment of almost sacred stillness, the kind that belonged neither to night nor day. The rhythm of the pendulum echoed like a heartbeat, slow, steady, eternal. He had spent decades refining the delicate gears that govern time's march. His hands, though calloused and weary, moved with reverence, as if touching the divine itself. For to control time was, in its own quiet way, to touch something beyond human measure. The clock before him was not just brass and iron. It was a soul, a living pulse of Florence itself. Outside, the moon rested low over the Duomo, and the faint hum of the city seemed to match the rhythm of that pendulum. For a brief, impossible moment, everything, the people, the buildings, the river Arno itself, seemed to move in perfect harmony. The city had learned to breathe with time. By now, Florence had become known throughout Europe for its clocks. Magnificent towers that rose over cathedrals and piazzas, each marking the passage of hours with chimes that resonated through the valleys. The sound of bells was no longer random or divine. It was mechanical, measured, human-made. And yet, to the ears of those who listened closely, there remained something mystical within it. A reminder that time, for all its precision, was still a mystery. The Guild of Clockmakers had grown from a handful of artisans to a powerful brotherhood. They met in secret chambers lit by candlelight, their faces illuminated by the gleam of polished metal and molten brass. There were whispers of competition, of secrets stolen between rival workshops, of apprentices who vanished after learning too much. The making of clocks had become both an art and a science, and like all great pursuits of man, it carried ambition, envy, and desire. In those rooms, one could almost feel time thickening. The very air seemed to hum with the tension between invention and faith. Some among them believed that by understanding time, they were fulfilling God's design. Others quietly wondered if they were challenging it. For centuries, time had belonged to heaven, measured by the rising and setting sun, by the ringing of church bells, by the prayers that divided the day. Now it belonged to man, divided into hours and minutes, gears and springs. There were stories of one clockmaker, older than most, his name nearly forgotten, who had disappeared from Florence altogether. Some said he had grown afraid of what his work had become. Others whispered that he had gone in search of something greater. The perfect clock, one that would not merely measure time, but reveal its secret, the reason it moved at all. Years later, a traveler claimed to have seen such a clock in a monastery deep in the hills of Tuscany. It was said to tick so softly that it could only be heard at night, when the world slept. And those who heard it swore they felt the world slow down, as if, for that moment, time itself paused to listen. Florence, by then, had changed. The Renaissance had taken root. Art, science, and philosophy intertwined like threads of a grand tapestry. Leonardo da Vinci himself had studied the mechanisms of clocks, sketching gears and escapements beside his flying machines. Michelangelo's David stood tall not far from where the first Florentine clock had once struck its lonely bell. And yet, amid all the beauty and creation, the quiet work of the clockmakers continued. Their hands turned, their gears clicked, and the heart of the city beat on. For every painting that captured a moment, there was a clock that reminded the world that moments pass. For every invention that sought to defy nature, there was a pendulum that gently swung it back into rhythm. By the late 15th century, time was no longer a whisper from the heavens. It was the hum of industry, the rhythm of labor, the schedule of trade and power. Florence had taught the world to live by the clock. The towers stood like guardians, each marking the pulse of the city, each bell a breath in the life of civilization. And yet, even now, centuries later, if you walk through those narrow Florentine streets at night, when the tourists have gone, when the Arno glimmers faintly under the moon, you might still hear it, a faint ticking somewhere behind the walls. The sound of gears turning slowly, patiently, endlessly. The sound of time remembering itself. Perhaps it is only imagination, or perhaps something more. The remnants of those early clockmakers, their hands immortalized not in stone or paint, but in motion. Every tick, every chime, every silent pause between seconds. It all began there in Florence, where man first dared to measure eternity. Now, take a slow breath in. Let it out. Feel your heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, patient. That same rhythm once echoed through the fingers of Florentine artisans centuries ago. The same pulse, the same motion. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the candlelight flickering on brass gears, the faint hum of the pendulum, the silence of the workshop at midnight. You are there, listening to the first heartbeat of time. And as the last sound fades, let the quiet return. The city sleeps, clocks keep watch. And somewhere, deep within the walls of Florence, time itself takes a gentle breath and begins again.